He grabbed the old man by the collar and slammed him against the brick wall so hard that the cardboard display of lottery tickets scattered across the wet sidewalk like playing cards thrown in rage. Nobody moved. 30, maybe 40 people standing in the rain, and not one of them said a word. They just watched. Some pulled out their phones. Most looked away. Because in this part of Chicago, on a night this cold and this dark, looking away was how you survived until morning. But one woman didn't look away. She was still in her scrubs, still had dried blood on her left sleeve from a shift that had started 16 hours ago and hadn't technically ended yet. She was carrying a paper coffee cup that had gone cold an hour back, and she was thinking about nothing more than getting to her car and driving home. Then she heard the sound of a skull hitting brick, and that changed everything. If you've ever stood in a crowd while something terrible happened right in front of you, and you felt that pull, that tug between what was right and what was safe, then this story is going to hit you somewhere you didn't expect. Because this isn't about a hero. This is about a woman who was tired, underpaid, running on bad coffee, and sheer stubbornness, who decided in one split second that she was done pretending not to see. And what happened next shook an entire criminal empire to its foundation. Stay with me until the end of this one. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. I drop stories like this every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. And do me a favor, drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that rainy sidewalk in Chicago, and the night that Sloan Mercer decided enough was enough. The man's name was Mr. Juan, and he had owned the same corner shop on West Erie Street for 31 years. He'd outlasted 2 recessions, a fire that took out half the block, 3 different landlords who tried to squeeze him out, and one very bad winter that killed his furnace and his refrigerator in the same week. He'd raised 2 daughters inside that shop, doing homework at the counter while he restocked shelves after midnight. He knew the names of his regulars' grandchildren. He kept a small bowl of hard candy by the register because he remembered that kids in the neighborhood didn't always have pocket money. He was 67 years old and weighed maybe 140 pounds soaking wet, which was exactly what he was right now, soaking wet, because the man holding him against the wall had dragged him outside into the November rain to make a point in public. The man doing the dragging went by the name Decker. He was broad across the chest in the way that suggested either serious gym time or serious steroid abuse, and the 2 men flanking him had the particular dead-eyed expression of people who had stopped seeing other human beings as people a long time ago. They wore dark jackets that didn't quite hide the shapes beneath them. They didn't need to hide them. That was the point. "We've had this conversation before," Decker said. He wasn't shouting. That was the worst part. He wasn't even raising his voice. He said it the way you'd remind someone their rent was due. Calm. Bored, almost. "Mr. Juan, we've had it 3 times now." The old man's fingers were wrapped around Decker's wrist, not fighting, just trying to keep from strangling. His feet were barely touching the ground. "I paid," Mr. Juan managed. "Last month I paid. You paid late, and you paid short." Decker released him just enough to let him drop back to his heels, then used his free hand to pick up one of the fallen lottery ticket displays and examine it with theatrical interest. "You know what happens when people pay short? It sends a message, and we can't have that message going out." The crowd had gathered without meaning to. People coming out of the Vietnamese restaurant 2 doors down. A couple of teenagers on bikes who'd slowed to watch. A woman walking her dog who had stopped moving entirely, the dog sitting obediently at her feet, picking up something wrong in the air. And then there was Sloan Mercer, 38 years old, attending trauma surgeon at Northwestern Memorial, who had just come off a double shift and had an emergency department that had seen 4 gunshot wounds, 2 car accidents, and 1 man who had somehow managed to get a steak knife lodged in his left shoulder before 9 o'clock. She had walked out of that building intending to do absolutely nothing except go home, pour 2 fingers of whiskey, and watch something mindless on television until she fell asleep on the couch. She heard the crack of the old man's head against the wall from half a block away. She stopped walking. Every sensible part of her brain, the part that had grown up in a neighborhood not entirely unlike this one, the part that had worked enough night shifts to know what violence looked like and how fast it escalated, told her to keep going. Cross the street. Call 911 from her car. Do not insert yourself into something that is none of your business and will not end well. She stood there for 3 full seconds, having that argument with herself. Then she walked toward it. She wasn't running. She wasn't charging in like someone from an action movie. She walked with the same flat, purposeful stride she used when crossing a trauma bay toward a critical patient. Not fast enough to cause panic, not slow enough to suggest hesitation. The walk of someone who had already decided what they were going to do and was simply closing the distance. She positioned herself between Decker and Mr. Juan before any of the three men had fully registered she was there. "Excuse me." Her voice came out completely level, not loud, just there. Decker turned. He looked at her the way people look at something mildly inconvenient. A parking cone. A slow driver. "Step back. He's bleeding." She was already looking at Mr. Juan, at the cut above his left eyebrow, where the back of his skull had caught the edge of a brick, at the way the blood was mixing with rainwater and running down the side of his face in thin pink rivulets. Her assessment took about 4 seconds. Superficial, but real. Needed pressure. Maybe a stitch. "Sir, can you tell me what day it is?" "What?" Mr. Juan blinked at her, bewildered. "The day. Do you know what day it is?" "It's Wednesday." "Good. Any ringing in your ears?" "Lady." Decker stepped sideways, trying to break her eye line with Mr. Juan. "I said step back." Sloane reached into the side pocket of her scrub jacket and pulled out a folded square of sterile gauze. She always carried a few, habit from a decade of trauma work, and pressed it gently against the cut above Mr. Juan's eyebrow. "Hold that," she told him. "Firm pressure, don't wipe." Decker grabbed her shoulder and shoved. It wasn't a brutal shove, it was a warning shove. The kind designed to remind someone of their place in the physical hierarchy of the moment. The kind that usually worked. Sloane stumbled back 1 step, caught her balance, and looked at him. Then, and this was the part that people who were standing there that night would talk about for a long time afterward, she smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not a frightened smile. The kind of smile that meant something she wasn't saying out loud yet. "Is that all you've got?" The silence that followed was the kind you could weigh. Someone in the crowd actually laughed. A short, shocked laugh, the involuntary kind. And then immediately went quiet, as if catching themselves doing something dangerous. Decker's expression shifted. The boredom was gone. Something harder moved in underneath it. "You have no idea what you just walked into," he said. "I have a pretty good idea." Sloane pulled the gauze gently away from Mr. Juan's forehead and checked the wound. Still seeping, but not arterial. She pressed it back. "I work in a trauma bay 4 blocks from here. I see what you people leave behind every Friday night." She looked at him directly. "I've stitched up 17-year-olds who got in the way of your point-making. I recognize the style." The man on Decker's left, shorter, twitchier, with a scar running from his ear to his jawline that someone had done a very bad job of closing, moved forward half a step. "Decker, I know." Decker didn't look away from Sloane. "Who are you?" "Nobody important." She said it without any particular emotion. "I'm just the person standing here." "Wrong answer." He took a slow breath, visibly recalculating. She had made a scene. She had made them a scene, in front of 40 witnesses, in front of phones that were probably already recording. He couldn't take that back. The only question now was how to manage it. "You're coming with us." Sloane looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the 2 men behind him. She looked back at Mr. Juan, who had gone very still in the way frightened people go still when they are trying to make themselves smaller. She handed the old man a second piece of gauze from her pocket. "Keep pressure on that," she said quietly. "If the bleeding doesn't slow in 10 minutes, go to Northwestern. Ask for the ER. Tell them you need a primary closure. Tell them Dr. Mercer sent you." "Doctor," Mr. Juan started, "I'll be fine." She said it with a certainty she didn't entirely feel, but the certainty was for him, not for herself. Then she turned back to Decker and said, "Okay. Just okay." As if she were agreeing to a change in lunch plans. The man with the scar actually blinked, like he'd been expecting something else. Fear, probably. Begging, maybe. Not this. They walked her to a black SUV idling at the curb. The interior smelled like cigarettes and something chemical underneath it. The kind of smell that specific vehicles carry when they've been used for specific purposes. Sloane sat in the middle of the back seat with a man on each side of her and Decker up front, and she looked out the rain-blurred window at the receding shape of West Erie Street and thought, with remarkable calmness, that she needed to think clearly and she needed to start right now. She had been afraid before. She knew what fear felt like. The physiological cascade, the cortisol spike, the way your hands wanted to shake if you let them. She had felt it in her first year of residency, when she had a patient bleeding out on the table and her attending had stepped out of the room, and she had been suddenly, completely alone with a dying human being and a decision she had 30 seconds to make. She had felt it. She had done the work anyway. That was the thing she'd learned. Fear wasn't the opposite of courage. Fear was just information. The question was what you did with the information. So she breathed, and she cataloged. 3 men. Decker was in charge, which meant he was the one whose ego was most engaged and therefore the most volatile. The man with the scar was a follower. He'd deferred to Decker 3 times in 2 minutes, which meant he'd do whatever the hierarchy told him. The third man, the driver, hadn't spoken at all, which could mean professional restraint or could mean limited initiative. She filed that away as useful. The SUV moved north. She tracked the turns with the methodical detachment of someone navigating by feel. 12 minutes later, they pulled into what had once been a warehouse district. She knew the area, had treated enough patients who came in through this corridor to recognize the specific geography of poorly lit industrial blocks and buildings that changed hands every few years without ever seeming to improve. They stopped in front of a building that looked abandoned from the outside with slightly too much intentionality. The rust on the loading dock doors was real. The graffiti was real. But the lock on the side entrance was not the kind you found on abandoned buildings. Decker opened her door and waited. Sloane got out. She noticed as they walked her inside that her hands were not shaking. She filed that away too. The interior of the building hit her with a very specific kind of sensory information that her trained mind processed faster than she could consciously articulate. 4 men visible immediately, 2 more at elevation on a catwalk that ran the length of the left wall. A single bright work light pointed downward at the center of the space, creating a harsh pool of illumination surrounded by deeper shadow. Concrete floor. Cold. The kind of building that kept no heat because no one was expected to be comfortable in it. 6 men she could see. Probably more she couldn't. The 4 on the ground floor arranged themselves with the loose, proprietary posture of people who'd spent a lot of time in this particular space. One was leaning against a support column with his arms crossed, watching her with the particular expression of a man who had already decided what was going to happen and was just waiting for the sequence to play out. He had a bandage around his right forearm, wrapped inexpertly, the kind of wrap someone does themselves in a hurry. Sloane noticed it. She noticed everything. So, the man against the column, older than the others, maybe late 40s, a face like a piece of leather that had gotten wet and dried wrong, pushed off and walked toward her with the unhurried authority of someone who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around him. "I'm told you made a scene." "I stopped a man from being assaulted," Sloane said. "If that qualified as a scene, that says something about your baseline expectations." A couple of the men exchanged glances. She had the impression this was not what usually happened during the opening minutes of these conversations. The older man stopped about 4 feet away. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize yet. Not anger, not amusement, something more like assessment. "Do you know who we are?" "You're the people who collect money from shop owners in exchange for not hurting them," Sloane said. "You use the word protection because it sounds better than what it actually is." The temperature in the room shifted. "Decker." The older man said the name without inflection. Decker stepped forward. Sloane watched him come. He stopped with about 2 feet between them, close enough to make the point. She held her ground and looked at him with the same expression she used when a pharmaceutical rep tried to talk over her during rounds. "You should be scared," Decker told her. "Probably," she said. "But I noticed that's the second time in the last half hour. Someone's told me what I should be feeling instead of listening to what I'm saying. That tells me something about how you people operate." Silence again. Then very quietly, the man against the wall, not the older one, a younger one she hadn't fully clocked yet, standing half in shadow near the far end of the space, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Decker turned to look at him. The young man stopped. The older man studied Sloane with renewed attention. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sloane Mercer." No hesitation. If she gave a false name and they found out, that created a different problem. "I'm a trauma surgeon at Northwestern Memorial. I've been on shift since 6 o'clock yesterday morning. I stepped in because an elderly man was being injured in public and no one else was going to stop it. She paused. I'd like to go home. I'm sure you would. The older man seemed to consider this seriously, which surprised her. That's not going to happen tonight. Sloane absorbed this. Okay, she said. He waited for more. She didn't give him more. He studied her for another long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the far end of the warehouse, apparently done with her for now. Sloane was left standing under the work light with 6 men who didn't know what to do with her because she wasn't doing what people usually did. She looked around the room with quiet, systematic attention. The man with the bandaged forearm was still leaning against the support column. He'd shifted his weight twice in the last 3 minutes. She'd noticed. I was favoring his right side overall, not just the forearm. The shoulder dropped slightly on that side, and his stance had the unconscious lean of someone managing a pain they were trying not to show. Stab wound, she thought. 2, maybe 3 days old, poorly cleaned. She filed it away. And in a dark car parked on the street outside the warehouse, behind glass that was tinted darker than street legal allowed, a man sat watching the building entrance with an expression nobody in that room would have recognized, because they had never seen Cassian Vescari look uncertain about anything. He had been across the street when Decker made his move against the shopkeeper. Standard protocol. He checked his crews periodically, without warning, to see how they operated when they thought no one important was watching. He'd seen a lot of things doing that. He'd made a lot of decisions based on what he saw. He had not expected to see a woman in blood-stained scrubs position herself between Decker and a 67-year-old shopkeeper with the calm authority of someone who owned the sidewalk she was standing on. He had not expected that smile. He had not expected those 4 words. He sat very still in the back of his car and thought about what he'd just watched, and what it meant, and what it said about the kind of person who did something like that. He didn't like the answers he was coming up with, not because they were wrong, but because they were uncomfortably clear. His driver glanced back at him in the rearview mirror. Mr. Vescari. Follow them, Cassian said quietly. And the car pulled away from the curb and moved north, through the rain, toward the warehouse district. Toward a woman who had no idea that the most dangerous man in the room hadn't walked into it yet. The man with the bandaged forearm had a name. Sloane heard one of the others call him Reyes, and she cataloged it the way she cataloged everything, quietly, without marking the moment. The way you learn to absorb information in a trauma bay when 6 things are happening at once, and you can't afford to look like you're paying attention to any single one of them. Reyes was getting worse. She could see it without needing to examine him. The subtle deterioration that her eye had been trained to catch across 15 years of emergency medicine, the slight glassiness behind the eyes that didn't quite belong to alertness, the way his breathing had grown incrementally shallower in the 40 minutes since she'd arrived. He was leaning harder on that column now, not dramatically, just a few degrees more than before, the kind of lean that happened when your body started quietly redistributing the effort of staying upright. He was running a fever. She was almost certain of it. Nobody else in the room had noticed. The older man, she still didn't have his name, had moved to the far end of the warehouse and was making a phone call, turned partly away from the room in the manner of someone accustomed to privacy in spaces that weren't private. 2 of the other men had drifted toward a battered folding table near the loading dock where a space heater glowed orange and a cardboard box of sandwiches sat open and largely ignored. The young man who had almost laughed was near the east wall, doing something on his phone with the studied nonchalance of someone trying to look like they weren't watching Sloane. Decker had not moved. I was standing approximately 8 feet away from her with his arms at his sides and his eyes on her face. And he had the specific quality of stillness that certain kinds of dangerous men have. Not relaxed stillness, but coiled stillness. The stillness of something with a hair trigger. You should sit down, he said. I'm fine standing. It wasn't a suggestion. Sloane looked at him. I've been on my feet for 19 hours. Standing is actually easier on my back at this point. His jaw tightened. I don't care about your back. I know. She said it without particular inflection. That's fine. The thing about Decker, she was learning, was that he was accustomed to a very specific kind of interaction. Targets who went small. Who apologized preemptively. Who tried to manage him with agreement and accommodation, working the angle of compliance the way you'd work a door that stuck. Careful, incremental, nothing that might break the handle. Her refusal to do any of that wasn't even aggressive. It was just absent. She wasn't defying him. She was simply failing to organize herself around his expectations. And that, for reasons that probably went fairly deep in his history, was driving him insane. She could see it in the muscles at the corners of his mouth. "Who do you think you are?" he said. Quiet. Controlled. But something was fraying at the edges of it. "I already told you who I am." "I don't mean your name." He took one step toward her. "I mean, who do you think you are, standing there like none of this matters? Like we're not—" He stopped himself. Sloane waited. "You think I won't—" "I think you're trying to figure out what I want from you," she said, "so you can use it. And you're frustrated because you haven't found it yet." The silence that followed had a different texture than the previous ones. This one had an audience. Two of the men by the table had stopped pretending to eat. The young man by the east wall wasn't looking at his phone anymore. Decker's face went very flat. That was the tell. She'd seen it before in the bay, on men who'd come in angry and hit the specific wall where anger became something colder and more deliberate. She knew what usually came after it, and she felt the first real surge of adrenaline she'd allowed herself since the sidewalk. "Decker." The older man's voice came from the far end of the warehouse. Not loud, but it landed like a hand on a shoulder. Decker didn't move for a moment. Then he stepped back. The older man walked toward them with his phone in his jacket pocket and his eyes on Sloane in a way that was different from before. He'd been on that call for several minutes, and something in his posture had reorganized itself. Less performative authority, more actual thought. "You said Northwestern Memorial." "Yes." "Trauma surgeon." "Attending physician. 8 years in trauma, 2 as chief resident before that." He looked at her for a moment. "You have any idea how many people I know who've come through that hospital?" "If they came through the trauma bay specifically," Sloane said, "probably a significant number. It's a busy unit." He made a sound that might have been appreciation or might have been something else. "You're either the stupidest woman I've ever met or the most confident. Those aren't mutually exclusive." He folded his arms. He had the build of someone who'd been physically imposing in his 30s and had shifted over into a different kind of imposing with age, the kind where the danger had migrated inward and stopped needing to announce itself. "What made you step in? Honest answer." "I told you." "Not the version you'd give a police report. The real one." Sloane considered him. It was a fair question, and she'd been asking herself a version of it since the moment she'd changed direction on that sidewalk. The comfortable answer was the principled one. Someone was being hurt. She intervened. True enough. But it wasn't complete. "The crowd," she said. 40 people and nobody moved. I've seen that before. I've been that before, when I was younger, in situations where the safe thing was to look away." She paused. "I stopped being able to do it somewhere around year 3 of residency. You see enough of what happens to the people nobody stepped in for, and looking away stops being an option." Something crossed his face. Not softness. She didn't think this man had much left of that, but recognition of something. Then he said, "That's a problem." "Why?" "Because it means you're going to do it again. Whatever I say to you tonight, whatever you agree to, you're going to walk out of here, and next time someone gets shoved on a sidewalk, you're going to do the same thing, and the time after that." He said it without judgment, almost analytically. "That makes you difficult to solve." "I wasn't aware I was a problem to be solved." "Everybody's a problem to be solved." He said it like it was just true. "The only question is which solution you apply." Reyes made a sound across the room. Nothing dramatic, just a sharp exhale followed by a suppressed grunt. And Sloane turned toward him before she was consciously aware of doing it. He had shifted his weight off the column and then immediately grabbed it back, and there was a thin sheen of sweat on his upper lip that had not been there 20 minutes ago. Her mind made 6 calculations in roughly 2 seconds. "Your man is septic," she said. The older man turned to look. "The wound on his forearm," Sloane said. "It's infected. The way he's been compensating all evening tells me it's not just the arm. The primary site is probably deeper. Shoulder, maybe." "When did he get hurt?" A beat of silence where several things happened at once. The men by the table straightened. Decker turned to look at Reyes, and the older man's jaw went slightly tight in a way that suggested this was not entirely new information, but was more advanced than anticipated. 3 days ago," said the young man by the east wall. He said it before he seemed to think about whether to say it, then caught himself and looked at Decker. Decker looked at the older man. He said it was fine, Decker said. 3 days of that not being treated properly, and it's not fine anymore, Sloane said. She was already moving toward Reyes without exactly meaning to, the pull of clinical necessity overriding the self-preservation calculation. Has he had antibiotics? Reyes himself answered, which surprised her. Some. From a guy we use. A guy you use. Yeah. What did he give you? I don't know. It was a pill, white. He said take 2 a day. Sloane stood in front of him now, close enough to look at his eyes properly. Pupils reactive, slightly dilated. Temperature, she pressed the back of her hand briefly to his neck without asking. Significant. That was 3 days ago. Have you been taking them? Sometimes. Sometimes. She kept her voice flat. Are you lightheaded? A pause. A flicker of what might have been embarrassment or might have been reluctance. A little. Pain in your chest? Any difficulty breathing beyond what feels normal for you? My breathing's fine. Let me see the wound. Reyes glanced at Decker. She's a doctor, Decker said, in a tone that made it clear he wasn't sure how he felt about any of this. Reyes slowly unwound the bandage. The smell hit her first, the specific Swedish rot smell that every ER nurse and doctor recognized and nobody ever fully got used to. The wound itself was in the meat of the forearm, a jagged laceration maybe 3 inches long, closed with what looked like medical tape and wishful thinking, red-bordered and weeping with the particular character of a wound that had stopped trying to heal and started trying to spread. She looked at it for a moment without expression. When the guy who gave you the pills saw this, what did he say? He said, keep it clean. He said, keep it clean. She straightened. This is tracking toward the lymph system. If the primary site is the shoulder or upper chest, which, based on how you've been holding yourself all night, it is, and the infection has been running for 3 days without adequate antibiotic coverage, you are potentially 3 to 6 hours from a level of systemic involvement that becomes very hard to come back from. She said it clearly and without drama, because that was how you said it. You need IV antibiotics, imaging, and probable surgical debridement. Not tomorrow, not in a few hours. Tonight. Reyes stared at her. She's exaggerating, Decker said. But he said it the way people say things they don't entirely believe. I'm a trauma surgeon, Sloane said, turning to look at him. I have been doing this for 15 years. I do not exaggerate about wound infections. The warehouse had gone very quiet. The older man was looking at Reyes. His expression was not warm, but it was not cold either. It was the expression of a man doing arithmetic that he didn't like the total of. Marco. That was apparently Reyes's first name. Why didn't you tell me it was this bad? It wasn't this bad 3 days ago, Reyes, Marco said. His voice had the defensive flatness of someone who'd made a decision and was now watching it not pay off. Didn't want to be... He stopped. Didn't want to be what? What? The older man said. Marco didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The word that fit in that space was obvious to everyone in the room. Weak. He hadn't wanted to be the one who needed help. Sloane had seen it 100 times. Men who arrived in her trauma bay 40 minutes or 4 hours or 1 day later than they should have because they'd been negotiating with their own pride. Sometimes she could fix what that delay had done. Sometimes she couldn't. He needs a hospital, she said. I don't have equipment here. I don't have anything here. You need to let him go. That's not... Decker started. I'm not negotiating for myself, Sloane said, and the steadiness in her voice came from somewhere that surprised even her. I don't care about me right now. I'm telling you that man has a window, and it is closing, and if you miss it because you're busy managing whatever this situation is with me, you will not get it back. Decker looked at the older man. The older man looked at Marco. Marco was holding his arm against his body in the way you hold something that has started to be more than pain, when it becomes a presence. His name is Gus, said the young man by the east wall. Everyone looked at him. He was talking about the older man. He said it to Sloane directly, with a kind of defiant openness, as if he'd made a decision too. That's who you're talking to, Gus Ferrante, and I'm... Tomas. Gus said it quietly. Not a reprimand exactly, more like a reminder of geometry, of where things were, who was where. Tomas went quiet, but he didn't look away from Sloane. Gus Ferrante studied her for a long moment. the look of a man recalculating weight distribution in real time. If I let him go to a hospital, he said, there are questions. There are always questions, Sloane said. There's a way to handle questions. There is no way to handle a person dying because you waited. She held his gaze. Is that the kind of problem you want? The kind that doesn't go back in the box? Another beat of the warehouse silence. The particular silence of a place with no soft surfaces, where sound died on concrete and steel without echo. And that was the moment the door to the warehouse went in. Not opened. Went in. A massive metal-framed thing that had been the loading dock's side entrance, torn from the upper hinge by a force that should not have been possible from the outside, slamming down and inward with a sound like a car accident compressed into half a second. What followed was not chaos in the movie sense. Real violence in an enclosed space is not choreographed and it is not quiet, and the first seconds of it are mostly about the body trying to process competing information faster than language can catch up. There was sound, sharp, percussive. Not all of it gunfire, some of it the structural response of the building itself. And there was movement, and there was the immediate physical reality of the floor shuddering under a concussive blast that came through the north wall with enough force to knock the standing work light sideways and plunge half the warehouse into hard shadow. Sloane hit the ground on instinct, not gracefully. Her left knee caught the concrete hard. Her coffee cup, still somehow in her left hand, shattered, and she went down behind an overturned metal rack with the mindless animal efficiency of a body that has decided, without consulting higher processes, that down was better than up. The air smelled like heat, an electrical burn, and something chemical that she processed distantly as some kind of accelerant. She lifted her head. Gus Ferrante was against the near wall, a weapon in his hand that she hadn't seen him produce, moving with a fluid efficiency that made it clear this was not a new situation for him. Decker had gone right. Tomas, the young one, had tried to get to Marco and was on one knee behind the folding table, which had become a very inadequate shield. Marco was on the floor, not down from the blast, down from the wound. He'd gone to one knee and not been able to get back up, and in the confusion and the noise and the light shifting and restructuring itself every few seconds around the angle of whatever was burning at the north end, nobody else had noticed. Sloane noticed. She had no particular thought about it. There was no internal speech, no weighing of options, no heroic calculus. She simply looked at a man who was going to die if he stayed on the floor in the wrong position, and her body moved toward him before her brain had issued a formal instruction. She got her shoulder under his right arm and pulled. He was heavier than she'd expected. They always were. And she was running on cortisol and body memory alone at this point, her knees screaming where it had hit the concrete, her hearing compressed to a narrow tunnel by the noise. "Get up," she said into his ear. Not unkind, just informational. "You need to move now." "I can't." "You can. Up." She pulled again. His legs found purchase, and he came up with her in the lurching, cooperative way of someone who had stopped arguing with the person helping them. She moved him toward the heavy concrete support column she'd been mentally noting as the best structural cover in the room since she'd walked in, and she got him behind it, and she got her back against it, and she looked around the edge of it at the warehouse and tried to understand what was happening. There were men she didn't recognize, at least 4 of them visible, moving with coordination through the gaps in the lighting, which meant this was organized, not opportunistic. They'd planned the breach point, probably planned the blown fuse or cut line that had taken out the main lights. They were targeting specific positions. They were targeting Gus Ferrante. She watched him work in the strobed half-dark and understood immediately that he was not someone who required assistance, but he was also, at the moment, managing 3 separate directions of incoming pressure with 2 men when there should have been 6. The men they'd lost in the blast. She couldn't see them, couldn't know. And the arithmetic was not in his favor. Thomas had made it behind better cover and was on his phone, talking fast and low. Decker was somewhere in the dark on the right side, and she could hear him but not see him. Marco's breathing against her shoulder had changed. More shallow. Faster. The stress was accelerating what the infection had been building toward. She pressed her hand against his chest. "Breathe slow. Match me." She demonstrated, drawing one measured breath, and felt him try to follow it. "Why are you—" he started. "Don't talk. Breathe." He breathed. She looked back into the warehouse. The north wall had a section that was genuinely on fire now. Whatever accelerant they'd used had caught something structural, and the light it threw was orange and unstable, and made the shadows move in ways that were actively disorienting. One of the unfamiliar men moved through it, and she tracked him automatically, her mind building a spatial map of positions and trajectories, the way it built surgical maps in her OR, where the instruments were, where the hands should be, where the blood was going. Gus went down. Not down dead. Down wounded. She could tell the difference across a room in bad light, and she had learned to make that assessment without letting herself feel what it meant until later. He hit the floor on one side and came up immediately on one arm, his left side compromised, and the man who had put him down was moving to close the distance. Tomas came out of cover with absolutely no tactical sense whatsoever and threw himself between Gus and the man who was closing in, which was the bravest and most structurally suicidal thing she had seen in a long time. And she watched the man's arm come up, and she heard herself say no out loud to nobody in particular. But the shot didn't come. The man who'd been closing on Gus stopped, went still. And from the shadow along the east wall, a part of the warehouse that had been apparently empty since the breach, a part that none of the attackers had cleared, a figure stepped forward. She could not see his face clearly in the shifting light. But the men who had come through the north wall could see him, and she watched them react to his presence the way you watched a group of people react to a specific sound, with the particular full-body recognition of something that changed the nature of the room they were in. He said nothing. He did not need to. Two of the four visible attackers actually stepped backward. Sloane held Marco against the column and looked at the man stepping out of the shadow of the east wall, and she thought, with a very strange and specific clarity, that's who they were afraid of when they came through that door. Not Ferrante. Not the men in this room. They came because they thought he wasn't here. Cassian Viscari had been standing in this warehouse for 11 minutes. She had not seen him come in. No one had seen him come in. He had entered through a service access panel on the eastern wall that wasn't on any visible inspection of the building's exterior, and he had stood in the shadow and watched, and she understood with a certainty that settled in her chest like cold water that he had been watching not just the breach, not just Ferrante's crew managing the incoming assault. He had been watching her. He crossed the warehouse floor without hurrying, and the men who had organized this attack made space for him, the way water makes space for something denser, and he stopped in the center of the room, and the quality of the violence around him changed. It didn't stop, but it reorganized itself, the way fire reorganizes around a break. He looked at Ferrante on the floor, at Tomas crouched over him, at the spreading shape of what Sloane could now identify as a lateral impact wound, left side, below the rib, and she was already calculating depth and likely trajectory from where she sat behind the column. She couldn't help it. It was as automatic as breathing. Then Cassian looked at the column. He looked at Marco, half collapsed against it with her shoulder under his arm. He looked at Sloane. He did not look at her with suspicion or with threat or with any of the things she'd been receiving since the sidewalk. He looked at her with something that was harder to categorize and harder, somehow, to stand under. "Can you help him?" he said, meaning Ferrante. Sloane looked across the warehouse at Gus Ferrante, who was being held upright by a 20-year-old with no tactical sense and a great deal of nerve, who was pressing his hand to his own side with the focused determination of a man trying to argue with physics. She looked at Cassian. "I need light," she said, "and I need someone to hold what I tell them to hold and not ask questions." He held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned and spoke 2 words to Tomas, and Tomas pulled out his phone and turned the flashlight on and crossed the room to where Sloane was already moving out from behind the column, already leaving Marco braced against the concrete, already moving toward the man who needed her most right now, crossing a floor covered in broken glass and spent casings, and the debris of a wall that was still, in one corner, quietly burning. She had no equipment. She had 2 pieces of folded gauze, a pen, her hands, and 15 years of knowing how to make something out of nothing. She knelt beside Gus Ferrante, and the light from Tomas's phone came down over her shoulder, and she looked at the wound, and she started to work. The wound was worse than it looked from across the room, which meant it was bad enough to matter. Sloane worked with Tomas's phone light coming over her left shoulder, and she worked the way she always worked under pressure, which was to say without any wasted motion, without any narration, without any of the running commentary that some surgeons use to manage their own anxiety. She had never been that kind of surgeon. She went quiet when it mattered. The noise came out later, usually alone in a car or a shower, and that was a system that had served her well for 15 years. Gus Ferrante was conscious, which was both helpful and not. Conscious meant she could ask him questions. It also meant he could feel everything she was doing, and Gus Ferrante was the kind of man who responded to pain by going very still and very controlled in a way that she recognized as more expensive than screaming. It cost more to maintain, burned through reserves faster, and created a specific kind of fragility she needed to manage around. "Stay with me," she said. "Not a question." "I'm with you." His voice was level. She gave him credit for that. "The entry point is clean. Lateral impact, didn't tumble on the way in, which is good. Means I'm dealing with a track, not fragmentation." She pressed the heel of her palm against the gauze she'd folded to 3 layers and applied to the exit side. "You're going to feel pressure." "I feel it." "Hold still." "I am holding still." "You moved." I breathed. "Then breathe smaller," she said. Tomas made a sound, not quite a laugh, but in the territory of one. Sloane didn't look up. The burning section of wall at the north end had mostly consumed itself. Whatever accelerant had been used had flash burned through its fuel source and left a section of exposed framing that was scorched but no longer spreading. The air still tasted like it, sharp and synthetic at the back of the throat. The main overhead lights were still down. The warehouse existed now in a geography of phone flashlights, and the residual orange glow from the north wall, and the particular thick shadow that collected in every corner of a space like this. The attackers who had come through the door were accounted for. She didn't know exactly how. She had kept her attention on Ferrante and trusted the sounds around her to tell her what she needed to know. But the particular quality of the room had shifted from active violence to its aftermath, which had its own sound, breathing, movement that was purposeful instead of reactive. Someone somewhere saying something in a low and very controlled voice. Cashin's voice. She could hear him but not quite make out the words. I was dealing with something at the far end of the space, and he was doing it with the specific cadence of someone issuing instructions that would be followed without question, which left the section of floor immediately around Ferrante to her and Tomas and 2 of the crew who had materialized from wherever they'd been during the fight and now hovered at a respectful and useless distance. "I need something to bind this with," she said. "Fabric, clean as you can find. Jacket lining, if nothing else." One of the hovering men pulled off his outer jacket without a word and handed it to her. She looked at the lining, synthetic, but tight-woven and uncontaminated by anything visible. She worked the inner seam with her fingers until a section gave way and tore cleanly, and she folded it into a long compress and began binding it against the layers of gauze already in place. "This is stabilizing," she said to Ferrante directly, because she believed in telling patients the truth of their situation in real time. Not fixed, stabilizing. You need imaging, and you need a proper closure, and you need it within the next few hours. This holds you until we can get you somewhere that can do those things. "Noted," Ferrante said. His color was wrong, she could see it even in the phone light, but his eyes were focused. "Do you have a doctor? Someone who can actually treat this properly?" A pause. "We have resources. I'm going to need you to use them tonight." She tied off the compress. "Not tomorrow, tonight." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he said, "Why are you doing this?" "You asked me that already." Gus did. His voice was lower now, more carefully managed. "I'm asking." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "Because you're injured and I'm a doctor, and those are the only 2 facts that matter right now." He held her gaze. "That's not the whole answer." "No," she said, "but it's enough." She pushed herself to her feet, her left knee registering its protest from the concrete impact with a specificity that she noted and set aside. She turned to check on Marco, who had stayed against the column where she'd left him, upright, which was better than she'd feared, though the color wasn't much better than Ferrante's. Tomas materialized at her left shoulder. He was maybe 22, she thought, the kind of young that still showed in the way he carried uncertainty, not hidden yet, not sanded down into the flat surface that years in a place like this eventually produced. He was looking at her with an expression that was too complicated to name quickly. "He's going to be okay?" Tomas meant Gus. "If someone gets him proper care in the next few hours, yes." She looked at him directly. "That's your job right now, not mine." Tomas nodded. Then he said very quietly, like he wasn't sure he was supposed to say it, "You didn't have to help him." "I know. You could have run. When the door came in, there was a second you could have—" "I know," she said again. He seemed to want more of an explanation. She didn't have one that would translate into language he'd find satisfying, so she didn't try. She turned around. Cassian Viscari was standing 6 feet away. She didn't know when he'd crossed the warehouse floor. That bothered her in a way she didn't examine too closely. She prided herself on spatial awareness, on knowing where bodies were in a room, and the fact that he moved through space without registering in her peripheral attention said something about him that she was still categorizing. He was looking at her with the same expression he'd worn when he stepped out of the shadow, the one that was difficult to stand under. Not because it was threatening, because it was attentive in a way that felt total, like being looked at by something that wasn't going to miss anything, and knew it, and wasn't performing that knowledge. He was taller than she'd registered from across the room, late 30s, maybe 40, dark-featured in the way that photographs didn't fully capture. There was a quality to the angles of his face that required 3 dimensions to make sense of, and she registered this in the distant, observational corner of her mind, the way she registered irrelevant data and kept it separate from the working analysis. He said, "You stabilized him. For now. With gauze and a jacket lining. And pressure and positioning, yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her the way he'd looked at her from the beginning of this, when he'd first walked into the warehouse and she'd felt the room change around him. You could have used that moment, when the door came in, to create distance. "Your man was going to bleed out." "He's not my man," Cassian said. "Ferrante runs his own operation. Tonight was a convergence of interests." He paused. "But yes, he was going to bleed out." "Then I did what I did." He turned this over, apparently. Then he said, "Why weren't you afraid?" The question landed differently than she expected because it was the same question she'd been asking herself on a loop since the sidewalk. Not the performed version, not the version she'd give a colleague over coffee, but the real one. The one that lived just below the articulate layer of herself and hadn't fully resolved into language yet. She looked at him. "Fear only matters," she said, "when you've already surrendered, and I don't know how to do that." The warehouse around them did something then, or her perception of it did. The ambient noise, the movement of Cassian's crew managing the aftermath of the breach, Tomas murmuring to someone near Ferrante, Marco's careful regulated breathing against the column. All of it receded slightly, the way sound recedes when your attention contracts to a single point. Cassian held her gaze and said nothing, and then the east wall exploded. Not the full wall, a section of it, roughly 8 feet of paneling and the steel framing behind it, blown inward by something external that was not the same as what had come through the loading door. This was different in character, more targeted, more specifically shaped. The kind of breach that wasn't meant to create chaos, but to create an opening at a precise location. And the opening it created aligned exactly with the spot where Cassian was standing. Sloane hit the floor a half-second before the pressure wave reached her, and this time she went down deliberately, with her arms over her head and her face turned to the side. And the debris that came over her was not catastrophic, but it was real, small things, fast things, the kind that cut without you feeling them immediately. She came up in the ringing aftermath and looked. 3 men through the new opening. Moving with the precision of the first group, but more focused, not clearing the room, not engaging Cassian's people. Moving toward Cassian, who was not where they expected him to be. He'd moved in the same fraction of a second she had, but differently. Not down, sideways, into the space behind the nearest support column, and the 3 men found a position that was occupied by disturbed air and scattered debris instead of a target. But one of them had already pivoted, and the pivot brought him past Sloane. He didn't look at her as anything meaningful. She registered as furniture, as obstacle or not, and his assessment took less than a second and came back negative. She was not a threat. He moved past her. And in that fraction of assessment, she saw his face clearly in the bad light, and she saw what was in his hand, and she saw the trajectory he was moving on, and where that trajectory terminated. It terminated at Marco. Marco, against the column. Marco, who had stayed exactly where she'd put him because she'd told him to stay, and he was running on infection and adrenaline and not much else. Marco, who could not move fast enough to matter. Sloane did not think about it. She moved, She caught the man's right arm at the wrist with both hands and used the full rotational force of her body the way she'd been taught in a self-defense course 11 years ago that she'd attended exactly once and apparently never fully forgotten. And the leverage worked better than she'd expected because he was moving forward and she redirected rather than opposed. And he went sideways into the column instead of forward past it. And the impact was his shoulder against concrete. And the sound it made was the sound of something structural giving way. He dropped. She stepped back. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them with a kind of distant surprise, as if they belonged to someone else. The shaking was the adrenaline finding its way out now that the action was done. Always happened this way, never during, always after. Cassian had dealt with the other two in the time it had taken her to deal with the one. She didn't ask how. She didn't look. She was looking at Marco, who was staring at her with an expression she had no category for. "You're okay," she told him. Her voice came out steady, which was more than she currently deserved. "Don't move." "You just—" Marco started. "I know. Don't move." Cassian came to stand beside her. He looked at the man on the floor, at the angle of the shoulder, at the specific way the arm was positioned. He looked at Sloane. She looked back at him. "That course," she said, meaning the self-defense thing, "I thought was a waste of a Saturday." Something moved in his face. Not a smile exactly, but in the territory. He turned and spoke to the two remaining crew members, rapid, low, specific, and they moved to manage the new breach and the 3 new men who were now being inventoried on the warehouse floor. And then Tomas said Cassian from across the room. His voice had a quality in it that cut through everything else. Not panic, something worse than panic. The flat, stunned quality of someone who has received information that has reorganized the world they were standing in. He was holding his phone. He'd been on it. She'd been dimly aware of him making calls, the kind of operational calls that kept things coordinated in a situation like this. He was not on it now. I was holding it and looking at it, and then he looked up at Cassian, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone who did not want to deliver what they were about to deliver. "It was Luca," Tomas said. The room temperature didn't change, but something in the room changed, something invisible and structural. Cassian said, "Say that again." "The breach points, both of them, the timing, the layout knowledge. They knew where the access panel was, Cassian. They knew about the panel." Tomas's voice was careful, the way you're careful with something that might break if you're not. "Luca is the only one outside this crew who knew about the panel." Luca. Sloane didn't know who Luca was, but she watched Cassian's face as the name landed, and she understood the nature of the information from the way he received it. The specific quality of stillness that descended, different from the controlled stillness she'd seen from him before. This one with something underneath it that was dark and not quite manageable. "Where is he?" Cassian's voice was very quiet. "He was at the Meridian location. He checked in 2 hours ago." Tomas turned the phone to show him something on the screen. He checked in, and then the location went dark. "What do you mean dark?" "I mean the 2 men we had there are not responding, and the building's security feed went offline 40 minutes ago." Cassian looked at the phone, at the information on it. He looked at it the way you look at a wound, with the clinical acknowledgement that this is real, and it has to be dealt with, and the time for being surprised by it is already over. Ferrante said from the floor, "How many people knew the Meridian location?" Cassian didn't answer him right away. Ferrante said it again. "Cassian, how many people?" "4, Cassian said, "including Luca." "Then you know what that means." "I know what it means." Sloane was watching this and cataloging it, and she was doing the thing she did in the trauma bay when multiple critical pieces of information arrived simultaneously, building the picture not from each piece individually, but from the spaces between them, from what each piece implied about the others. Luca was someone Cassian trusted. The access panel information was specific and structural, the kind of thing you didn't accidentally know, the kind of thing that had to be deliberately passed. The Meridian location housed something important enough that 2 men had been eliminated and a security system cut to access it. And the timing of both attacks, the loading door breach and the east wall breach, was coordinated in a way that required knowledge of the warehouse's interior geography. This was not an outside job. This was not a rival syndicate making a blind move based on rumor and opportunity. Someone had handed them the blueprint. "What's at Meridian?" she asked. Several people looked at her. She looked back at them without particular self-consciousness. It was a relevant question. Cassian looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Tomas. "Show her," he said. Tomas blinked. "Cassian, show her." Tomas turned the phone toward her slowly, like he was still not fully convinced this was the right call. The screen showed a building schematic overlaid with a satellite image. A mid-sized commercial building, anonymous exterior, somewhere in what looked like the warehouse district's northern edge. Markers on the schematic. She looked at the markers and understood, in a general way, what they represented. Not product, not money, personnel. "Those are people," she said. "Yes," Cassian said. "Your people." "Some of them." He paused. "Some of them are not mine. Some of them are civilians. People who needed somewhere to be for reasons that are complicated and not relevant to right now." She looked at him. "Protected people," he said. And the way he said it was not comfortable. It was the way you say something true that you've never been required to say out loud before, and the saying of it changes its shape slightly. "How many?" 11, plus the 2 guards who are not responding. Sloane looked at the schematic. She looked at the markers. She looked at Cassian, and she saw something in his face that she had not seen there before. Not the controlled assessment, not the authority that reorganized rooms around it. Something unguarded, something that lived underneath the other things, and was showing through a crack that the news about Luca had made. "They're running out of time," he said. It was not a question. If whoever went into that building intended harm, yes. She kept her voice flat because that was how you managed your own response to a situation. You stayed in the clinical register until you could afford to be otherwise. 11 people, compromised location, no security. Yes, they're running out of time. Gus Ferrante tried to sit up. Tomas pushed him back down with one hand. Ferrante didn't fight it. "The people who hit this warehouse," Ferrante said, "were the distraction. The real play is Meridian." He said it with the resignation of a man confirming something he'd already calculated. "And Luca gave them everything they needed to run both at once, knowing we'd be occupied here." "It was a good play," Cassian said, very quietly. "It was a good play," Ferrante agreed. "Doesn't make him less dead when we find him." "No," Cassian said, "it doesn't." Sloane was looking at the schematic on the phone. She was thinking about the markers. She was thinking about 11 people in a building that had just lost its security, with whoever had planned this level of coordinated operation now presumably inside or closing on it, with Cassian's available crew reduced by the 2 engagements tonight, with Ferrante down, with Marco down, with the clock having started some time ago and still running. She was thinking about all of that, and she was thinking about one other thing, a thing she could feel at the edges of her thinking but hadn't fully admitted to herself yet. She looked at Cassian. He was looking at her. "You need to go," she said. "Yes." "Now." "Yes." A beat. Then he said, "You should stay here, with Ferrante. You've done—" "No." She said it clearly. "You have 11 people in that building, including people who are not yours, and are there because they needed protection. You have a crew that just took 2 hits. You have a traitor's intelligence working against you, which means whoever is at Meridian knows your approach options." She stopped. She could hear herself. She could hear the trajectory of what she was about to say. "I know buildings." He waited. "Structurally. I worked 2 years in disaster medicine, mass casualty, structural collapse, post-earthquake response in 2 different countries. I know how buildings fail, and I know how people move through them under duress." She could hear herself, and it sounded insane, and it was also the most logical thing she had said in the last 3 hours. "I know things about how to use a building against people in it that you don't know." Cassian studied her with an attention that was not comfortable. "You want to come," he said. "I want those 11 people to not die in a building while we stand in this one." She met his gaze. "That's not the same thing." The quiet in the warehouse had a held breath quality. Tomas was looking between them. Ferrante, from the floor, was watching Sloane with an expression she still couldn't fully decode. Cassian said, "If something goes wrong—" "Something has already gone wrong," she said. "That's why we're having this conversation." He held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he turned to the 2 remaining crew members and issued 3 sentences of instruction and turned back to her. "Stay close," he said. "I know how to follow instructions," she said. "I give them professionally." And they moved. The night outside the warehouse was cold in the specific way that Chicago November is cold. Not the cold of temperature alone, but the cold of wind off water, the kind that found the gaps in whatever you were wearing and made itself known with a precision that felt personal. Sloane registered it and moved through it and did not allow it to become a reason to slow down. Cassion's car was not the one from outside the warehouse. That one was compromised. He said so without elaboration, and she didn't ask. The vehicle they moved to was 2 streets over, a dark sedan that one of the crew brought around with the efficiency of a practiced maneuver, and they were moving within 90 seconds of clearing the warehouse door. In the back seat, Cassian unfolded a physical map, paper, which surprised her, and then on reflection didn't, and oriented it in the low light from the car's interior and began marking approach routes with a pen. She leaned in and looked at the schematic on Tomas's phone, which Tomas was holding between them in the front seat. "What's the building's age?" she asked. 1960-something, Tomas said. "Converted commercial, steel frame, original. Original steel frame, 60s construction. The utility runs building services, water, electrical. If someone cut the security feed manually, they did it from inside, which means they either had access before they arrived or they created access at a specific entry point." She traced the schematic with one finger without touching the screen. "What's on the ground floor?" "Storage. Nothing occupied." "So they came in low and moved up. The 11 people, where in the building?" "3rd floor, north section." North section of a steel frame 60s building means the main load-bearing structure is here and here, she pointed. The north section is the most interior, furthest from external access, which is probably why you chose it. But it also means the exit options are limited, and the utility access is... She stopped. She looked at the schematic. She looked at it with the specific focused attention of someone who has seen something that needs to be confirmed before it's said out loud. "Tomas," she said, "the fire suppression system for this building, is it original or updated?" Tomas frowned. I don't know. Why?" "Because a 1960s steel frame building with original fire suppression runs its main water lines through a central shaft that in this configuration," she traced it, "would run directly adjacent to the north section's interior corridor. If that system is triggered, manually or otherwise, the pressure in those lines creates a blind spot in the corridor," Cassian said. He was looking at where her finger was on the schematic. He said it without inflection, like confirming a fact he'd just received. "Not a blind spot," she said. "A barrier. If the suppression system activates, the spray pattern in that corridor makes it effectively impassable for anyone trying to move through it, including people trying to reach the north section from the interior approach." She looked at him. "Including whoever is in that building right now." Cassian looked at the schematic for a long moment. "You're saying we trigger it deliberately," he said. "I'm saying that whoever planned this operation planned around your approach routes and your personnel and your security systems. They did not plan around a trauma surgeon who spent 2 years in disaster medicine." She held his gaze. "They don't know I'm here. They don't know what I know." The car was moving north through streets that were quiet, in the way Chicago streets went quiet after midnight. Not empty, but purposeful. The people still out at this hour having specific reasons to be there. Cassian folded the paper map. He looked at it for a moment after it was folded, his hand still on it, and she recognized the expression, the brief, almost invisible pause of a man who was adjusting to a new version of a situation he'd thought he'd already mapped. "If the suppression system triggers," he said, "the people in the north section, get wet," she said, "and have 30 seconds of reduced visibility and noise cover to move to the secondary stairwell here." She touched the schematic again. "Which is where you need to have people positioned." He looked at the position she was indicating. He looked at her. "And if the timing is wrong," he said. "Then we adjust," she said. "That's what you do when the timing is wrong. You adjust." The car turned north and the warehouse district gave way to the particular mixed geography of the city's industrial residential border, and the Meridian building was 7 minutes away. And somewhere inside it, 11 people were in a situation that had been designed from the start. Designed around betrayal, around inside information, around the assumption that Cassian Vescari would be dealing with a warehouse attack when the real move was made. The assumption had been correct. What it had not accounted for was the woman sitting in the back seat of his car in blood-stained scrubs, with a knee that was going to be spectacular shades of purple by morning, looking at a building schematic on a borrowed phone and seeing not a trap, but a system she could use. The Meridian building was dark in a way that buildings aren't supposed to be dark. Not the ordinary dark of closed offices and turned-off lights. This was the specific dark of a building that had been made dark on purpose. Every external indicator of occupancy and function stripped away. The way you'd dress a stage before the performance you didn't want anyone to see. Sloane registered it from half a block away and said nothing because Cassian had clearly registered it too. She could tell by the way his posture changed in the seat beside her. Not more tense exactly, but more organized, the way a body organizes itself when it has stopped processing information and started applying it. The car stopped 1 block south. Cassian was already out before it fully stopped moving. Sloane was 2 seconds behind him. The cold hit her again, the Lake Michigan variety, the kind with teeth, and she pulled her scrub jacket tighter across her chest and followed him into the shadow of the adjacent building's overhang and looked at Meridian from 30 meters out. 7 stories, steel frame, 60s construction, exactly what the schematic had told her. The facade had the particular blankness of a building that had been commercial once and then forgotten by whatever economy had originally required it, taken over by purposes that didn't benefit from visibility. The windows on the lower floors were dark and unbroken. The ground-level entry points she could identify were a main door, 2 service doors on the east and west faces, and a loading bay on the north side that the schematic had shown as sealed. Cassian had 4 people with him, including Tomas, who had left the situation with Ferrante in the hands of 2 others and inserted himself into this without being asked, in the way that Tomas apparently did things. The 4 of them moved with the practiced coherence of people who had done versions of this before, taking positions without being told to, reading the geometry of the space in real time. Sloane was not one of those people. She knew it. She stayed at Cassian's left shoulder and kept her breathing even and her eyes moving. "How do we know they're still in there?" she asked. Very quiet. "We don't," he said. "But the building's feeds went dark 40 minutes ago, and no one has come out the primary exit since. You have someone watching." "I have someone watching." He raised a hand, and one of the 4, a woman Sloane's approximate age, short hair, an expression like a closed door, peeled off toward the east service entrance and disappeared into shadow with an efficiency that was startling. "Vera takes east," Cassian said, not really to anyone. Then to Tomas. "You're with me. North loading bay." He looked at the remaining 2 men, one built like something industrial, one lean and fast in the way that suggested economy of motion was a habit, not an effort. "West service, hold the position, do not breach until—" "The suppression trigger," Sloane said. "You need to tell them what they're waiting for." Cassian looked at her, then at the 2 men. "When the suppression system activates, you have 30 seconds, and then you move, not before." They nodded and moved. Then it was Cassian and Tomas and Sloane moving north along the building's shadow line toward the loading bay. "The utility access for the suppression system," Cassian said, walking, not looking at her. "Where is it?" "Interior east wall, ground floor. In a building this age, it'll be a manual override panel. Red, usually marked because code required it even then. The question is whether they've put someone on it." "They'd need to know to put someone on it." "Yes. And they don't know about you." "No." He nodded once. It was the nod of someone updating a calculation, not of someone feeling reassured. The north loading bay was sealed the way the schematic had showed. Large rolling door, padlocked, the kind of lock that was industrial and serious, and also the kind she had watched Tomas open in approximately 4 seconds with a tool he produced from somewhere inside his jacket, with the practiced ease of someone who had done this particular thing enough times that it no longer registered as a skill. The door rolled up in silence, or near silence. There was a sound, a low metallic complaint from the track, and all 3 of them went still for a moment and waited to see if it mattered. Nothing moved inside. They went in. The ground floor of the Meridian building smelled like closed space and old concrete, and the particular dusty chemical smell of industrial cleaning products used infrequently and left to settle. The dark in here was total. No ambient light from windows, no residual glow from anything. Cassian had a small tactical light that he used at the lowest setting, pointing down, giving them enough to navigate without giving away their position from the exterior. Sloane oriented herself against the schematic she'd memorized in the car. East wall was to her right. The interior corridor ran north-south. The utility panel she needed was this way, she said. She moved before she fully decided to move, which was a pattern she was recognizing in herself tonight, and she acknowledged it and kept going. Cassian fell in behind her, which was a gesture of trust she was not going to examine in the current moment, because the current moment had other requirements. The east wall's interior surface was brick-clad over the steel frame, and she ran her right hand along it as she moved, feeling for the recessed section that would indicate the utility housing. The schematic had placed it roughly 60 feet from the north entrance. She counted steps. 40. 50. Her hand found the edge of a panel at 57. She stopped. The panel was steel, recessed maybe 2 inches into the wall, with a handle that required a quarter turn. Standard. She'd opened dozens of these in disaster response work. Different buildings, different cities, same basic infrastructure logic that hadn't changed since the 60s. Because if something works, you don't redesign it. Here, she said. Cassian was at her shoulder. He looked at the panel. He looked at her. When I trigger this, she said, keeping her voice barely above breath, you have 30 seconds before the spray saturates the third floor north corridor. The people in the north section. They'll be moving before you trigger it, Cassian said. Tomas. Tomas already had his phone out, a text composed and unsent. He showed Cassian the screen. Cassian read it and nodded. Send it, he said. Tomas sent it. A message to someone on the third floor, someone inside, which meant someone who was with the 11 people Cassian had in there, someone with a working phone, which meant the people inside had some degree of preparedness for being contacted this way. She filed that away. They waited. 8 seconds. A return message. Tomas showed it to Cassian. Cassian showed it to Sloane. It said, understood. 4 of them. Armed. Corridor outside our door. 4 armed individuals between the north section and the secondary stairwell she'd identified on the schematic. 4 who were positioned in exactly the interior corridor that the suppression system would make impassable. 4 who did not know she was standing 40 feet below them with her hand on a utility panel. 30 seconds is enough? Cassian asked her, directly. Not a rhetorical question, an engineering question, the kind you ask someone you'd decided to trust with a specific calculation. To move 11 people from the north section to the secondary stairwell? If they move the moment they hear the system activate, yes. The spray in that corridor will be disorienting for anyone in it, noise and visibility both compromised. And the people in the north section will have the advantage of knowing it's coming. She paused. But whoever is in that corridor will recover. You have 30 seconds of disruption, not 30 seconds of incapacitation. 30 seconds is enough, Cassian said, not repeating her, confirming something he'd already decided. He looked at Tomas. Something passed between them that was wordless and clearly practiced. The specific communication of people who had been in bad situations together enough times that language had become redundant for certain categories of information. Tomas moved for the interior stairwell, which was south of their position, the long way around to the secondary stairwell the 11 people needed to reach. He was going to be in position on those stairs when the system activated. She understood this without being told. Cassian looked at her. You trigger it and you go back through the loading bay, he said. You wait outside. No. His expression did something complicated. This isn't... I heard what the message said. 4 armed people in that corridor, another however many who hit this building before we arrived. If Tomas is on the secondary stairwell alone and 4 people come through that corridor before 30 seconds are up... She stopped. I'm not waiting outside. You have no weapon. I have a building, she said. Let me use it. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she could hear her own pulse in the silence of the ground floor, feel the cold of the panel under her palm. Then he said, trigger it and go left. Interior corridor runs north. There's a maintenance room at 30 feet. The door will be unlocked because the people who came in before us will have cleared it and left it open. Get inside and stay inside until I come for you. And if you don't come, I'll come. She looked at him. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. He held her gaze, steady and direct and without the performance of reassurance. Just the truth of the moment. Trigger the panel. She turned the handle. The sound of the suppression system activating was not the dramatic sound of movies. It was industrial and immediate, a deep hydraulic thunk from somewhere in the building's infrastructure, followed by the hiss of pressure moving through pipes that hadn't been called on in however long, and then the sound of water, which started as a distant percussion and built quickly into something that filled the building's acoustic space entirely, and she felt the pressure wave of it in the floor under her feet before she heard the spray reach the upper floors. She let go of the panel. She went left. The corridor was absolute dark except for Cassian's tactical light, which was already moving ahead of her in the direction of the stairwell. She counted steps. 20, 25, 30. The maintenance room door was open. She went in. The room was small and smelled like rust and disuse. She pressed herself against the interior wall, pulled the door to within an inch of closed, and listened. The building was full of water sound. The suppression system's reach was impressive. She could hear it even down here, a pervasive white noise that flattened everything else into its lower register. But not everything. She heard feet on the stairwell above, moving fast. Multiple people, the rhythm of a group moving together, which was the 11 people from the north section. She hoped. She had to hope, because the alternative was that the timing had been wrong. Then she heard something else, closer, heavier. Someone on the ground floor. She went very still. The footsteps were moving along the corridor she'd come from, moving from the north toward the south, which was away from her position. One person. Moving with purpose, but not running. Controlled, deliberate. The footsteps of someone who had a destination rather than someone responding to the suppression trigger. She pressed herself further against the wall and watched the inch of gap at the door. A shape passed. She couldn't see the face in the dark, but she could see the build. Medium height, narrow across the shoulders, moving with the particular forward lean of someone under pressure, someone who had somewhere to be and was trying not to look like they were hurrying. She had seen that lean before. She had seen it less than 2 hours ago. In the warehouse. The shape passed the gap in the door and kept moving south, toward the loading bay, toward the exit she'd come in through, and her mind was doing the thing it did when competing pieces of information resolved into a pattern that was ugly and coherent and explained things she hadn't understood before. The east wall breach at the warehouse, the panel access, the timing. She thought about the word Tomas had said, Luca. She didn't know what Luca looked like, but she thought about Gus Ferrante on the warehouse floor, and she thought about the call Ferrante had been making when she'd been working on his wound, the low, careful voice at the far end of the space, and she thought about the moment, a moment she had registered and set aside and now retrieved, when Ferrante had looked at his phone and then looked not at Cassian but away from Cassian, and she thought about the geometry of a man who is not quite as wounded as he appears. She thought about that for approximately 2 seconds. Then she pushed the door open and moved. She went south, fast and quiet, following the shape she'd seen in the gap, and the maintenance room was 25 feet from the loading bay entrance, and she covered it in seconds and came around the corner of the loading bay entrance in time to see the shape crouched at the door, phone in hand, thumb moving across the screen. Sending something. She said, "Stop." The shape turned, in the low wash of ambient light from the loading bay's north-facing access. She could see him now, younger than she'd expected, mid-20s, a face that was currently doing something complicated between alarm and the specific blankness of someone switching registers fast. He was not holding a weapon. The phone was what was in his hand. The phone was the weapon. "Who are you?" she said. He stopped. He looked at her scrubs, her face, the directness of her stance. He was calibrating. She could see him doing it. "You were in the warehouse," she said. "You were one of Cassian's crew." "I don't know what, Stop." She took one step toward him, and he took one step back toward the door, and she said, "If you send that message, it tells whoever is waiting outside this building that something has changed. It updates their plan. People die because of the update." She held his gaze. "Put the phone down." He looked at her. He looked at the door. He looked at the phone. She watched him make the calculation, and she watched the calculation come out wrong for her, and she moved before he did. Not toward him, but sideways to the door track, and she hit the control panel on the loading bay wall with the heel of her palm, and the door came down. Not slowly. These doors came down fast when the motor engaged, industrial weight, the rolling shutter dropping with a sound like controlled collapse. And it hit the floor before he reached it, and the outside was gone, and it was just the two of them in the loading bay in the dark. He turned, and she could see him processing. Exits, options, the person between him and the door. The phone, she said. You don't understand what you're... The phone, she said again. Luca said... He stopped himself. There it was. Luca said what? Her voice was very quiet now. The young man... Not young, she revised. He just read young. There was something experienced in the way he was holding himself now, something that the calibration had stopped hiding, looked at her with an expression that was not quite despair and not quite resolve, the expression of someone who has passed a point and knows it. Luca said the woman wasn't part of it, he said. Said she was a civilian, said she'd be gone before the Meridian move. I'm not gone, she said. I noticed. A sound from above, not the suppression system. The suppression system was still running, overlaying everything, but through it, footsteps, multiple sets moving on the secondary stairwell. Moving down. The 11 people. Getting out. The young man heard it too. She watched him do the arithmetic of what that meant. It's over, she said. Whatever the plan was, it's over. The people on the third floor are on the secondary stairs right now. He looked at the ceiling, at the sound coming through it. Luca's going to want to know that, he said, quietly, almost to himself. Where's Luca? He looked at her. Tell me where Luca is, she said. Why would I? Because you're 25 years old, and this is the moment that decides what the rest of your life looks like. And I've been watching you make decisions under pressure for the last 30 seconds, and you are not stupid. She kept her voice even. Luca traded 11 people for whatever he wanted from the other side. You were the message runner. You didn't know that's what you were when you signed on tonight. I can see it on your face that you didn't know, which means you still have a choice about what you do right now. He stared at her. Above them, the sound of feet on the stairs, getting closer. Third floor, he said, finally. Luca's on the third floor. He stayed to... He stopped. He pressed his mouth together. To make sure. She understood what that meant. She moved for the interior door, the one that led back to the corridor and the stairwell, and she hit it at speed and went through, and the sound of the suppression system swallowed everything else. And she was in the corridor and she was running. The stairwell door was 30 feet ahead. She hit it and took the stairs two at a time, and her niece screamed at her from the first landing, and she told it to wait and kept going. One flight, two, the sound of the suppression system changing character as she climbed, growing louder and more immediate, the spray reaching her from somewhere above on the second floor transition. She felt the mist of it, cold and sharp, plastering her hair to her forehead as she pushed through the second floor landing door and crossed to the next stairwell access. The secondary stairwell. She could hear them now. The 11 people, some of them, the sound of controlled, hurried movement coming down toward her, and she flattened herself against the wall to let them pass, and she looked at their faces as they came. A range of ages, a range of expressions, most of them somewhere between controlled fear and the specific focused blankness of people following instructions they've decided to trust. One woman carrying a child that couldn't have been older than 4, the child's face pressed into the woman's neck, arms tight, the sound the child was making swallowed by the noise of the suppression system. She counted them as they passed. 8, 9, 10. She looked up the stairwell. The 11th person wasn't coming. Wait, she said to the last person passing, a man in his 40s, close-cropped hair, moving with the compact efficiency of someone who had military in his history. Is someone still up there? He stopped, barely. An older woman. She wouldn't come. She said she couldn't do the stairs. Her legs. He was already looking down the stairwell, the pull of self-preservation visible in every line of him. Someone stayed with her. Who stayed? I don't know. A young guy, one of Cassian's people. Tomas. She was already going up. The third floor. The suppression system spray on the third floor was not the movie's version of sprinklers. It was not a gentle overhead shower. It was a system under full industrial pressure that had been dormant long enough to have mineral deposits in the lines, and when it activated with the specific aggression of infrastructure that had been waiting, and the north corridor of the third floor was essentially a wall of water noise and limited visibility and the kind of thorough soaking that removed the concept of dry from the situation entirely. She came through the stairwell door onto the third floor, and the spray hit her immediately, her scrubs saturating in seconds, and she stood in it and looked down the corridor. The north section door was 40 feet ahead. It was open. Between her and the open door, three things. One, a woman of approximately 70, seated on the floor with her back against the corridor wall, legs extended, the expression on her face, the expression of someone who had made a decision and was keeping it. Two, Tomas, crouched beside her, his arm around her shoulders, saying something into her ear with the urgent intensity of someone who has been saying the same thing for the last 90 seconds and watching it not work. Three, two men blocking the corridor between her position and them. Not four, the message had said four. She did the arithmetic in a fraction of a second and understood. Two had gone with the exiting group, possibly neutralized, possibly waiting elsewhere. Two were here, standing in the suppression system's spray like they'd been planted there, soaked through and not moving, each of them with a weapon that the spray was making complicate but not impossible. They had seen her come through the stairwell door, and from the north section, from inside the open door 40 feet away, Luca came out. She knew it was Luca because she had seen Ferrante's face when Tomas said the name, and she had stored that as data without knowing why, and now she understood why. Luca was the kind of man whose face made people make expressions like Ferrante's. Late 30s, compact, with the specific quality of composure that was different from Cassian's. Cassian's composure came from whatever he was made of underneath, from something structural. Luca's came from the absence of something. He moved into the corridor and looked at the situation. The woman on the floor, Tomas, her standing at the stairwell door soaking wet in scrubs. And his expression organized itself with the unhurried precision of a man revising a plan in real time. "You're the doctor," he said, over the sound of the spray. "Yes." "You triggered the suppression system." "Yes." He processed this. "How did you know about the panel?" "I used to do disaster medicine." He blinked, once, which was the closest thing to surprise she'd seen on his face. Then something almost like appreciation moved through his expression and left without settling. "Inconvenient," he said. "I'm told that." "The people you helped move—" He gestured with the device in his hand, not a weapon, something that she recognized after a second's delay as a remote trigger of some kind. "They're in the secondary stairwell." "Yes." "Which means they're between the charges I set on the secondary stairwell and the ground floor." The sound of the spray filled the corridor. She looked at the device in his hand. She looked at Tomas, whose eyes had gone to the device the moment she looked at it, whose face had done something that she felt in her own chest like impact. She looked at the old woman on the floor, who had stopped looking at Tomas, and was now looking at Sloane with the calm, clear gaze of someone who has decided to see what happens next. "You set charges on the secondary stairwell," she said. Not a question. Saying it to make it real, to make it land in the present tense where it could be dealt with. "Standard contingency," Luca said. He said it without relish, which was almost worse than if he'd seemed to enjoy it. Just operational. If the primary extraction was compromised, the secondary needed to be closed. He paused. "I didn't anticipate the primary extraction being compromised by a trauma surgeon." 8 people are on that stairwell right now," she said. 10, Luca said. He was more precise than her count. "I know where everyone in this building is." He looked at her steadily. "I've known where everyone in this building was since I placed the charges." The spray was soaking through everything. She could feel her pulse in her knee where it had hit the concrete, and she could feel her hands, and they were not shaking, and she needed them to not be shaking because she needed to think. "What do you want?" she said. He looked at her with what might have been the beginning of respect, in a different version of this situation. "I want Cassian Viscari to make a choice," he said. "That's always what this was. I set this up so he would have to stand in a hallway and choose between his operation and the people his operation exists to protect. I want him to feel what that's like." "Why?" "Because he made that choice for me," Luca said. 4 years ago. He chose the operation." He paused. "My brother was in a stairwell. My brother was not the primary concern." The water came down. Somewhere below them, 8, 10. People were standing on a stairwell above charges they didn't know were there, waiting to move, waiting for Cassian's signal. And from behind her, from the stairwell door she'd come through, she heard Cassian's voice. He'd come up the main stairwell. He was at the door. He pushed it open and came through, and he saw Luca, and the corridor went very still. In the way corridors go still when two specific people look at each other after a long time. The water came down on all of them. "Cassian," Luca said. His voice was even, almost gentle. "I was wondering when you'd get here." Cassian looked at the device in Luca's hand. He looked at Sloane. He looked at Thomas and the woman on the floor. He looked back at Luca and everything she'd seen in his face in the course of this night, the authority, the calculation, the unguarded thing that had shone through after the news about Luca in the warehouse, all of it reorganized into something quieter and more specific. "How long have you been planning this?" Cassian said. "Long enough to do it right," Luca said. 4 years of long enough. "Your brother? Don't." Luca's voice dropped a register. Just one word and the gentle quality was gone from it entirely. "Don't talk about my brother in that voice. I heard you use that voice before. At the funeral, I heard the whole speech. Marcus made a choice. Marcus was 22 years old, and he was in that building because you put him there," Luca said. "And when it came down to the operation, or getting him out, you chose the operation, and you gave a very good speech about it afterward." The water came down. Cassian held Luca's gaze and did not look away from it, and did not say anything, and she watched him hold it, and she understood from the way he held it that there was something in what Luca was saying that he was not going to argue with. That landed in her chest like a stone. She looked at the device. She looked at the two men between her and Tomas and the woman on the floor. She looked at the corridor, the suppression spray, the limited visibility, the noise that was still filling everything, and she thought about what she knew about this building, about steel-frame 60s construction, about the utility layout, about the specific infrastructure logic that hadn't changed since the code was written, and that she had been reading schematically and physically all night, and she saw something. Not a plan. The beginning of a plan. The architecture of one. She looked at Cassian. He looked at her. And in the spray-saturated, water-loud, badly lit corridor of the third floor of the Meridian building, with Luca's thumb over a trigger and 10 people on a stairwell beneath charges, and an old woman on the floor and Tomas with his arm around her, and 4 years of grief pointing a device at all of them, Sloane Mercer looked at the man beside her and said, very quietly, just for him, "The electrical panel for this floor is inside the north section, behind the door he just came out of." Cassian's eyes didn't move from hers. "The suppression system and the building's electrical share a conduit on this floor," she said. "If the electrical trips, if someone pulls the main breaker for this floor, the suppression system's pressure valve releases. It's a safety interlock. The system shunts water back to the main line." He held her gaze. "If the pressure releases," she said, "the charges on the secondary stairwell get wet," he said. "Standard det cord is rated to—" "I know what it's rated to." He said it very quietly. He was doing the calculation. She could see him doing it. "The panel is behind him." "Yes." "Getting to it means getting past him." "Yes." "And the two men between us and Tomas." "Yes." She held his gaze. "But not both of us." The water came down, and the corridor was a corridor of noise and visibility, reduced to 20 feet, and Luca standing at the far end of it with the device and 4 years and a brother's name. And Cassian looked at her for one more second with the unguarded thing showing through the crack again. And she looked back at him with what she had, which was everything she'd had since the sidewalk on West Erie Street. Not the absence of fear, but the decision about what to do with it. "You go left," he said. "You go right," she said. And Luca, watching them, said, "Whatever you're—" But they were already moving. They moved in the same instant, which was the only way it could work. Cassian went right, directly toward the two men blocking the corridor, drawing their attention and their weapons and everything else they had, because that was what the geometry required. He was the threat they understood, the variable they'd been told to account for, the face that meant the operation had been compromised. And when he moved, they moved toward him with the reflexive certainty of people responding to the known quantity. Sloane went left, not toward them. Along the wall, low and fast, using the spray and the limited visibility, and the fact that she was the variable nobody in this corridor had fully accounted for. She was the woman in scrubs. She was the trauma surgeon. She was the one who was supposed to be waiting outside. She was already past the first man when he started to turn. She hit the north section door at full speed with her shoulder. and the door gave way and she went through it into the room beyond. The north section interior hit her with a different quality of dark. The suppression system reached in here too, the spray coming from ceiling fixtures that were angled differently than the corridor, and the mist of it was pervasive and cold, and it made the air into something thick and silver in the beam of the one working emergency light at the far end. The room was large, open plan, the kind of space that had been set up for habitation rather than storage. Cots along the walls, a folding table with equipment she didn't stop to inventory, the residue of people living in a temporary way in a permanent building. The electrical panel was on the east wall. She crossed the room in 8 seconds. The panel was where she'd said it would be. A commercial electrical box, metal, gray, the kind with a main breaker at the top and individual circuits below. And it had been here since the building was built, and it would outlast everyone in the building by decades. She hit the cover latch, and the cover swung open, and she looked at the main breaker. 60 amperes, red handle. The simplest mechanism in the building. She heard something from the corridor. Impact, movement, a sound she didn't fully process because she was looking at the breaker, and she was thinking about the 10 people on the secondary stairwell below, and the charges on that stairwell, and the suppression system's pressure valve, and the interlock that was built into the system in 1967 because the code required it. Because someone in 1967 had thought about exactly this failure mode and built in a release. She pulled the main breaker. The emergency light went out. The north section went into the specific dark of a room with no light source of any kind, and for a moment the only thing in Sloane's world was the sound of the spray and the feeling of the open panel under her hands, and the smell of wet concrete, and the knowledge that either the interlock was working or it wasn't. Then the sound changed. Not immediately, not dramatically. It changed the way a river changes when something upstream shifts. A gradual reorganization of pressure. The spray from the ceiling fixtures stuttering, losing urgency, going from full industrial output to something diminished, and then the hiss of the release valve somewhere in the building's infrastructure, a long mechanical exhalation, and the spray died. The suppression system dropped to silence. The silence was enormous. She stood in the dark with her hand on the open panel, and she listened to the building without the overlay of the water noise, and what she heard was the corridor, Cassian, movement. She moved back toward the door. In the corridor, without the spray, and with the emergency lighting from the stairwell casting a pale lateral glow through the open stairwell door, she could see. Cassian had one of the 2 men against the wall. The other was on the floor, not unconscious, down, holding his knee in a way that communicated very clearly that it was no longer structuring weight in the correct direction. Cassian's face had a cut above the left eye that was producing the specific fast bleed of scalp wounds, running into his eyebrow and down the side of his face, and he was breathing hard in a way he was not quite managing to control. Tomas was standing. The old woman was still on the floor, but she was upright against the wall, and Tomas had stepped away from her and was positioned between her and the section of corridor where Luca was. And his positioning was the positioning of someone who has decided on a specific geometry and is holding it. Luca was looking at the device in his hand. He was looking at it the way you look at something that has stopped working. The flat, recalibrating look of someone whose plan has just changed shape in a way they weren't prepared for. The suppression system was down. The charges on the secondary stairwell were wet. And whatever trigger mechanism Luca had assembled for a system that required dry DEET cord had just become a device that did nothing except sit in his hand and tell him the story was different than he'd written it. "It's done," Sloane said from the north section doorway. Luca looked at her. His face was wet from the spray, his dark jacket saturated, his hair plastered to his forehead, and in the pale emergency light he looked younger than he had in the full dark of the corridor. Not older the way bad news usually aged a person, but stripped of something, the performance of composure washed away along with everything else. He looked at the device one more time, then he looked at Cassian. 4 years, he said. His voice was different from what it had been. Not broken. Just changed. The operational precision was gone. What was underneath it was simpler and worse. Cassian looked at him. His face had the blood from the scalp wound running down one side, and he didn't wipe it. "I know. Marcus was in that building for 6 hours before. I know. And you chose?" "Yes." Cassian said it without deflection, without the qualified language that people reach for when they are trying to be technically honest while escaping the full weight of what they did. Just, yes. I made the call. I chose the operation over getting him out. The corridor was very quiet. He was 22, Luca said. Yes. He trusted you. Yes. Luca looked at him for a long moment, holding the useless device, soaking wet on the third floor of a building he'd spent 4 years planning to use for exactly this moment. And the moment had arrived, and it hadn't given him what 4 years of planning had promised it would give him, and she could see that understanding arrive in his face in real time, which was the most brutal thing she'd seen all night. He's still dead, Luca said. Yes, Cassian said. He is. Tomas moved very slightly, just a shift of weight. Cassian raised one hand, not toward Luca, toward Tomas. And Tomas went still. What happens now? Luca said. Cassian looked at him for a moment that had real duration, real weight. Right now, nothing. Right now, we get the people on that stairwell moving, and we get Ferrante treated, and we deal with the men you brought into my building. He paused. And then we talk. Talking, Luca said. Flat. Talking, Cassian said. Unless you have a better option. Luca looked down at the device in his hand. He turned it over once. Then he set it carefully on the floor. Not dropped, set, with a precise deliberateness that was its own statement, and straightened up and looked at Cassian with the expression of a man who has exhausted the version of himself that knew what to do next. Tomas exhaled. She could hear it from where she was standing. She crossed the corridor to the old woman on the floor. Can you put weight on your legs? She asked. The old woman looked up at her. She had the kind of face that had been handsome for decades and had transitioned into something better than handsome. Specific, layered, the face of someone who had survived enough things to stop being surprised by them. I can try, she said. That's all I'm asking. Sloane got her hands under the woman's arms and helped her up, slowly, letting her find the distribution of weight across both legs and adjust. The woman winced but did not make any other sound. I'm Elena, the woman said. Sloane. You're a doctor. Yes. Elena looked at her with clear, dark eyes. You're also completely soaked. Yes, Sloane said. So are you. Elena looked at her for another moment. Then she almost smiled. Let's get out of this building, she said. They got out of the building. It took 20 minutes to account for everyone. The 10 people on the secondary stairwell brought back up and redirected through the main stairwell once Cassian's crew had cleared the ground floor. The 2 men from the corridor who were managed with the same efficient competence that Cassian's people seemed to apply to everything. Luca, who walked out under his own power between 2 of Cassian's crew with the specific composure of a man who has run out of moves and is choosing how he carries that. Outside, the Chicago November had not warmed up. Sloane stood on the sidewalk in front of the Meridian building and let the cold hit her soaking scrubs, and registered, for the first time in several hours, what her body was actually doing. Her left knee had graduated from complaint to formal protest, a deep, structural ache that radiated up into her hip and down into her shin. She had a cut on her right forearm that she'd apparently acquired during one of the 2 warehouse breaches without noticing. 3 inches, not deep, but bleeding with the persistent insistence of wounds that get ignored. Her hands were doing the shaking again, the post-adrenaline variety, and she stood in the cold and let them shake and looked at the street. 3 vehicles had arrived. Cassian's people, called in by Tomas during the approach. They were moving people and managing logistics with the wordless efficiency of an organization that had done versions of crisis management many times, in many configurations, and had developed protocols that didn't require explanation. Elena was in the back of the nearest vehicle, a blanket around her shoulders, talking to a young woman who was clearly someone she knew, their foreheads almost touching. The 10 people who'd been on the stairwell were distributed across the other vehicles, some of them shaking, some of them silent, most of them in the state that Sloane recognized as the immediate aftermath of fear that had been held very tightly, the loosening that happened when you were finally allowed to let it go, which was its own kind of undoing. One of them, the man with the military bearing who had told her about Elena, stopped beside her on the sidewalk. The charges, he said, on the stairwell. Wet, she said. They needed dry conditions. The suppression system, I know what you did. He looked at her steadily. He was maybe 50. The kind of face that had seen real things and organized itself around that. I was standing on that stairwell when the water came down. She waited. Thank you, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, Go get warm. He nodded once and moved toward the vehicles. She turned around. Cassian was standing 10 feet away. He had a cloth against the cut on his head. Someone had provided it, pressed it on him, probably Tomas. And he was holding it there with a distracted quality, the way people hold things they've been told to hold while their mind is somewhere else. His jacket was ruined. His face had the blood and the water and the particular exhaustion that came not from physical effort alone, but from a specific kind of expenditure, the kind that burned the reserves that weren't replenished by sleep. He looked at her forearm. You're bleeding, he said. I noticed. I'll handle it. He stopped. He looked at her with an expression she recognized now, the unguarded thing, which was becoming less of a crack and more of a consistent quality of how he looked at her. The panel, he said. The interlock. Yes. How certain were you that it would work? She considered lying. The comfortable answer was the confident one, that she'd run the numbers in her head and the interlock was standard, and the outcome was predictable. It would have been a satisfying answer. It would also have been incomplete. 70%, she said, maybe 75. The system was 60s construction. The interlock was designed for that generation of hardware, but I didn't know the maintenance history. He absorbed this. You went for it at 70%, he said. The alternative was letting 10 people stand on a stairwell above active charges. She held his gaze. 70% was the best number in the room. He was quiet for a moment. The cloth against his head was doing its job. The bleeding was slowing. He'd need a closure on it, maybe 3 stitches. She could see the anatomy of the wound from here, and it was manageable. I'll need to look at that, she said, meaning the cut. I have resources, she said. I know, you keep saying that. She kept her voice dry. I'm also available. I know how to close a scalp wound, and I'm standing right here. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, All right. Thomas appeared at Cassian's shoulder with a first aid kit that was dramatically better equipped than anything Sloane had used tonight. Actual suture material, actual antiseptic, actual medical tape. She looked at it and then looked at Tomas and he shrugged. We have resources, he said. I've been informed, she said. She worked on Cassian's scalp in the ambient light from the vehicles. 3 interrupted sutures, the same technique she'd used 10,000 times on foreheads in the trauma bay, and her hands had stopped shaking by the time she placed the first one. She worked close and she worked quietly, and he held still with the practiced quality of someone accustomed to having wounds treated without making a thing of it. After the second suture, he said, without moving his head, Luca. What about him? What I told him in there. What I admitted. She placed the third suture, tied it, cut the tail. I was there. I know you were there. A pause. I need you to understand that the decision I made 4 years ago was still a decision, she said. He was quiet. A 22-year-old died because you chose the operation, she said. She said it without particular inflection, the way she said hard things to patients. Not to wound, not to perform toughness, but because clarity was a form of respect. You can explain the context, you can explain the constraints and the information you had, and the calculus you were doing in real time. All of that may be true. She pressed gauze against the closed wound and held it. It doesn't change what it was. No, he said. It doesn't. And Luca will be dealt with carefully, he said, not in the way you might be thinking. She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, the way you looked when someone was working on your head, and movement was inadvisable. 4 years ago I failed his brother, Cassian said. Tonight he tried to kill 11 people to make me feel that. Those are both true at the same time, he paused. What I owe Marcus I cannot pay. What I owe the people who are on that stairwell, I can pay that. And what I do with Luca will be determined by what he is now, not by what I did then. She removed her hands from his head. The wound was closed and the gauze was holding. She took a step back and looked at her work. Is that justice? She asked. I don't know what justice is in a situation like this, he said. I know what's possible. He turned to look at her. Is that an unsatisfying answer? Yes, she said, but I think it's an honest one. He held her gaze. The cut above his eye was closed and clean, and the blood had been washed away by the spray, and what was left was the face underneath it. 40 years of a life she would never fully know, organized into features that she had been reading all night in bad light and worse conditions, and that she could read now, in the amber glow of vehicle headlights on a Chicago street at 3 in the morning, with the clarity that came from having been through something with someone. "You should be home," he said. "Yes. In the version of tonight where you didn't turn around on that sidewalk, you would be." "In the version of tonight where I didn't turn around, an elderly man bled in the rain by himself while 40 people watched," she said. "I don't want to live in that version." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "I'll have someone drive you." "I can call a—" "I'll have someone drive you," he said again. Quiet. Not a negotiation. She looked at him. "Okay," she said. The drive back across the city took 35 minutes. The driver was one of Cassian's people, the compact, economical motion one from the earlier approach, who had a name she never caught, and a quality of presence that was unobtrusive in the way that professional discretion was unobtrusive. He drove without conversation and without music, and Sloane sat in the back seat and looked out at Chicago at 3:30 in the morning, at the specific character of the city in the dead hours when it showed you its actual bones, the streets without performance, the lights that nobody had turned off and nobody was using, the architecture stripped of the population that gave it purpose. She was soaking wet and had a cut on her forearm and a knee that was going to sideline her from the OR for at least a week, and a body that was running on approximately nothing, and she sat in the back of a car driven by a man she didn't know and felt, with a clarity that was strange given the circumstances, the specific quality of being completely present, not okay, not resolved, just here. The driver stopped in front of her building. She got out. The cold hit her again, still personal, still Lake Michigan. She looked up at the building. The driver said nothing. She hadn't expected him to. She went inside. In her apartment, she stood in her kitchen for a while without turning on the overhead light, the ambient glow from the city coming through her windows, giving the room the quality of a space held in suspension. She put water on for coffee that she probably wouldn't drink. She looked at her hands, still, now, the shaking long since done. She thought about a few things. She thought about Mr. Juan, standing on the wet sidewalk with gauze pressed to his forehead, and about the specific way he'd looked at her when she said she'd be fine, the trust in it, and also the doubt, and also the choice he'd made to believe the one over the other. She thought about Tomas, who had thrown himself between Gus Ferrante and a man who was closing in on him, with no tactical sense and what turned out to be enough nerve. She thought about Elena in the back of a vehicle with a blanket around her shoulders, and the 2 words she'd said on the floor of the 3rd-floor corridor, "Let's go," and the specific quality of decision in them. She thought about Luca, setting the device on the floor with that deliberate care. She thought about Marcus, who was 22, and who she had never met and never would. She thought about Cassian, standing in the spray-saturated corridor, saying yes to every accusation. Luca leveled, not because it disarmed Luca. It didn't entirely, but because they were true. She was still standing in her kitchen when the sun came up. She watched it happen through the window, the specific Chicago February dawn that came gray before it came anything else. A reluctant arrival, the sky deciding on light in increments. She watched it, and she held her coffee cup, and she thought about nothing in particular and everything at once, which was a mental state she recognized from the aftermath of very long shifts in the trauma bay, the mind sorting itself after sustained demand. She called the hospital at 7. "I need to speak to the charge nurse," she said. "It's Dr. Mercer." The charge nurse was a woman named Carol who had worked the trauma bay for 19 years and had seen more of what the city produced than almost anyone and had organized her responses accordingly, efficient, clear, and essentially unsurprisable. "You're supposed to be on at 9, Carol said. "I know, I need to push it. I have a knee issue." A pause. "How bad?" "Not surgical, but walking through a trauma bay for 8 hours is probably not what it needs today." "I'll pull in Hendricks." Another pause. "You all right?" Sloane considered the question. "I'll be in tomorrow," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at the dawn through the window. "Yeah," she said. "I'm all right." Carol made a sound that indicated she was accepting this for now and reserving the right to revisit it. "Get some rest," she said. "Drink water, and whatever the knee needs. Rice, Sloane said. You're telling a nurse what Rice stands for. Force of habit. Carol hung up. Sloane sat down at her kitchen table and drank the coffee, which had gone lukewarm, and let the morning arrive. 3 days passed. On the second day, she went back to work. The knee was better in the functional sense, still swollen, still sending up specific complaints when she stood too long, but manageable with compression and stubbornness, which were resources she had in sufficient supply. She did her shift. She was in the trauma bay for a knife wound at noon and a multi-vehicle accident at 4 and a child with a high fever at 7 who turned out not to be as critical as the paramedics had feared, which was the best kind of outcome. She stitched and assessed and instructed and moved through the day with the particular focus of work that had always been the most reliable geography she knew, the place where the requirements were clear and the metrics were honest and what you did either helped or it didn't, and you found out. On the evening of the third day, Carol appeared at her elbow during a quiet interval between cases and said, without preamble, "There's a man at the desk asking for you." Sloane looked up from the chart she was reviewing. "Patient?" "Not patient. He says he said to tell you it's about the neighborhood clinic." She looked at Carol. Carol looked back at her with the expression of someone who is not going to ask questions because she has calculated that she doesn't want the answers. "I can tell him you're busy." "No," Sloane said. She put the chart down. "I'll go." The man at the desk was not Cassian. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. She hadn't let herself think specifically enough to form an expectation. But the man at the desk was middle-aged and nondescript in the particular way that people who were meant to be nondescript achieved it, with a sealed envelope in his hand and a polite professional expression. "Dr. Mercer," he said. "Yes." He handed her the envelope and left. No conversation, no lingering. He was simply there and then not there, with the clean efficiency of someone who had delivered what they came to deliver. She held the envelope. It was sealed with no markings on the exterior. She turned it over in her hands once, feeling the weight of it. Something inside more than paper, a thickness that suggested more than a note. She opened it at the nurse's station because she was practical about things. Inside was a single card and 2 items that she processed in the order she encountered them. The first was a check made out to the Northwestern Memorial Neighborhood Clinic Initiative, which was a fund she had personally been trying to build donations for since the previous spring, in an amount that she looked at for a moment and then looked at again, because the number was the kind of number that changed what was possible. The second was a photograph, small, black and white. An older image. The paper was slightly yellowed at the edges. A shopfront she recognized because she had been standing in front of it 4 nights ago. Mr. Juan's store on West Erie Street, the lottery ticket display in the window, the particular character of a neighborhood shop that had been exactly where it was for 31 years. The photograph had been taken recently. She could tell because the lottery display in the window was the new configuration. She'd seen the old one scattered on the sidewalk in the rain. And this was a different arrangement. This was after. The shop was open. The lights were on inside. The familiar shape of Mr. Juan was visible at the counter. On the card was no signature, just 7 words, in plain handwriting that she somehow recognized without having seen it before. "He won't be paying anyone anymore." She stood at the nurse's station for a moment. Carol appeared at her shoulder, looked at the card, looked at the check, looked at Sloane. She did not say anything. She was 19-year veteran Carol, and she had made her calculations. Sloane put the card and the photograph in her coat pocket. The check she would process through proper channels in the morning. She went back to work. On the 4th day she heard, through the particular community that emergency medicine practitioners formed with the police and social workers who moved through the same geography of the city's harder edges, that the extortion network operating in the West Erie corridor had gone quiet. Suddenly and completely quiet. In the way that things went quiet when the infrastructure beneath them had been removed rather than simply threatened. 3 of the businesses she knew of, because she knew the neighborhood, because she treated its people, because a trauma surgeon who worked 4 blocks from a street spent 10 years learning that street. In the way you learned things that mattered, had reopened for normal business without the particular tension that had been part of their ambient quality for as long as she'd known them. She heard this and she filed it and she went about her day. On the 5th day, she walked to West Erie Street on her lunch break. It was cold, still, always. the November cold that would be December cold soon, and then something worse. And she walked with her hands in her coat pockets and her breath making small clouds, and she went to Mr. Juan's shop. He was behind the counter when she came in. He looked up when the door opened. When he saw her, something in his face went through several expressions quickly before arriving at the one he settled on, which was not quite what she'd expected. He looked relieved, not grateful. She had expected grateful. She was prepared for grateful. She had the deflecting response ready. He looked relieved, the way you looked at someone you had been worrying about. "I wasn't sure you were all right," he said. She stopped just inside the door. "I'm all right," she said. "I called the hospital. They said you'd been out a few days." "Nee," she said. "I'm back." He looked at her for a moment, assessing with the particular accuracy of someone who had spent decades reading the faces of people who came in and out of his shop and had learned to tell the difference between what people said and what they meant. "You should have some tea," he said. "I have to get back." "5 minutes," he said. "I have hot water already." She stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she came in and let the door close behind her. She sat on the stool behind the counter that was clearly there for the long hours between customers. And Mr. Juan made tea in the specific way of someone who had been making tea in this shop for decades. The sequence established, unhurried, the movements so practiced they had become a form of rest rather than effort. He put a cup in front of her and put one in front of himself, and sat on a second stool, and they sat together in the warm air of the shop, with the street outside going about its business in the cold. "The men," Mr. Juan said after a moment. "They haven't come back." "I heard that," she said. "People are saying—" He stopped. "There are different stories. About why?" "There usually are," she said. He looked at her. He had the dignity of someone who had decided what questions to ask and which ones to leave where they were. "Will they stay away?" She held the teacup. It was warm. "I don't know," she said. "I think so, but I don't know for certain." He nodded. He looked out at the street through the window, at the winter morning and the people moving through it, at the display of lottery tickets that had been restocked since the night it was scattered on the wet pavement. "My wife used to say," he said, "that you could tell a lot about a neighborhood by who showed up when something went wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "For a long time I thought this neighborhood didn't have those people anymore." She looked at him. "She was wrong," he said, "or I was wrong about thinking she was wrong." He picked up his tea. "I'm still working that out." Sloan looked out the window, too, at the street, at the ordinary architecture of a Thursday morning in a neighborhood that was not going to make the news today, that was just doing what neighborhoods did, existing, requiring, producing the daily inventory of small moments that nobody recorded and nobody thought to memorize, and that made up, in aggregate, the actual texture of a life. "How's the cut?" she asked. He touched his forehead, where the wound had been. It had healed. She could see the line of it, faint now, a few days of clean healing. "Good," he said. "No stitches needed in the end." "Good," she said. They drank their tea. She went back to work. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening, she was getting into her car in the hospital parking structure when she noticed a figure across the street. It was dark. The parking structure's lighting was the specific, inadequate variety that hospital administrators perpetually promised to improve, and she would not have noticed at all, except that the figure was not moving, just standing. On the opposite sidewalk, near a parked car, in the specific manner of someone who was not waiting for a bus or looking at their phone or doing any of the things that people did on sidewalks. Just present. She looked. He looked back. She couldn't make out his expression at this distance, in this light. She could make out the posture, the particular quality of stillness she recognized by now, the kind that didn't broadcast itself. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she lifted one hand. Not a wave, not a signal, just an acknowledgement. She got in her car. He didn't approach. He didn't follow. When she pulled out of the structure and turned onto the street, she looked in her rearview mirror and the sidewalk was empty. She drove home through the city in the dark. She thought, on the drive, about a question she'd been turning over since the warehouse, since the third-floor corridor, since the conversation by the vehicles outside Meridian. The question of what it meant to do right things inside wrong structures. Whether it was possible. Whether the right things survived the structure they were done inside, or whether the structure contaminated them. Whether a check to a neighborhood clinic written by hands that had done the things those hands had done was a right thing or a different kind of thing. She didn't arrive at an answer. She didn't think she was supposed to yet. Some questions were for carrying, not solving. You carried them, and they changed shape as you moved, and after long enough you realized the carrying was the point. She thought about Luca, and about Marcus, and about a 22-year-old who trusted the wrong person in the wrong building and died for it. She thought about the weight of that, not the dramatic weight, not the cinematic weight, but the actual daily weight of a decision that could not be unmade and had to be lived next to forever. She thought about Tomas, who was probably somewhere in the city right now doing something that required more nerve than sense, and who would be fine. She thought about Elena, who had sat on a wet floor in the middle of an operation designed to kill her, and who had said, "Let's go," with the calm practicality of someone who had decided a long time ago that the most useful response to bad situations was movement. She parked in front of her building. She sat in the car for a moment. She thought about a man standing on a sidewalk across from a parking structure, not approaching, not following, just present, just acknowledging the way she had acknowledged, the two of them separated by a street and a distance that was also something more than a street. That was the whole calculus of what they were to each other, which she had no clean language for and was not going to force into language that didn't fit. She thought about 4 words she had said on a wet sidewalk 4 weeks ago, under the specific impulse of a moment she hadn't planned and wouldn't plan differently. She got out of her car. She went upstairs. She made dinner. She ate it. She sat at her kitchen table with the photograph of Mr. Juan's shop in front of her. She'd taken it out of her coat pocket the night she received it and put it on the table, and it had stayed there, which was a decision she was making without quite making it. She looked at the photograph, at the lights on inside the shop, at the shape of a man at a counter. She thought, this is what it looks like. Not the rest of it, not the warehouse or the corridor or the charges on the stairwell. This. An open shop on a street in Chicago. Tuesday morning, the lights on. She put the photograph down. She went to bed. She slept better than she had in months. Outside, somewhere in the city that was always running its nocturnal inventory, the streets sorting themselves out, the buildings holding their occupants and their histories, the lake sending its cold opinions up through every gap. A sealed envelope appeared under the door of the neighborhood clinic on West Erie Street. Inside it was a cashier's check with no return address. Also inside it was a card with no name and 3 words. Keep going. See. The clinic director found it in the morning. She stood for a long time looking at the check. Then she looked at the card. She put both in her desk drawer. She opened the clinic. The lights came on. The street was the street. And in a city that contained all the things cities contain, the violence and the repair of it, the damage, and the people who showed up anyway, the questions that didn't resolve, and the right things done inside imperfect structures, and the small persistent fact of open doors on ordinary mornings. An unremarkable Tuesday arrived, and moved through its hours and left, and was replaced by another one, as they always were, as they always would be.